Emperor Sirius of the mighty Nausicaan Empire found himself on his knees in front of a human, begging for the inferior race to save his galactic dominion from total annihilation at the hands of a mysterious and technologically superior alien armada. The year was 2347, and humanity had colonized several star systems, but still remained a backwater species on the galactic stage, especially compared to the powerful Nausicaans who spanned hundreds of worlds. But now this empire faced an unprecedented existential crisis. A terrifyingly advanced alien fleet had emerged without warning from uncharted space, effortlessly cutting through Nausicaan defenses and laying waste to their colonies with weapons that seemed like magic. Entire Nausicaan battle fleets were being swatted aside like flies by the invaders. Sirius's military minds were stumped. His people were being slaughtered. In a last desperate gambit, Sirius secretly dispatched an envoy to Earth, hoping to enlist aid from the humans against this cataclysmic threat. Swallowing his pride, the Emperor was forced to admit that perhaps the unconventional thinking and unpredictable tactics of these upstart Terrans could be the key to the Nausicaan Empire's survival. On Earth, a retired military mastermind named George Cox was approached by the Nausicaan delegation. A brilliant strategist but jaded and haunted by his past, George was at first very reluctant to get involved, especially in helping a notoriously arrogant and brutal empire like the Nausicaans. But as Emperor Sirius revealed the true nature of the crisis, the horrific toll the invaders were exacting on Nausicaan space, George realized that if these juggernauts rolled over the Nausicaans, his own species would likely be next on the chopping block. The stakes couldn't be higher. It was help the Nausicaans now, or watch humanity burn later. Seizing the opportunity, George agreed to aid the Nausicaans, but on some conditions. Humanity must be given a seat on the Galactic Council and access to advanced Nausicaan technology. The Emperor initially balked, but in his desperation was forced to concede to the humans' demands. Assembling a crack team of Earth's brightest military minds, including his old friend and rival Admiral Jack Wilson, George and his squad shipped out to the Nausicaan front lines. Once there, the savvy human strategist began analyzing the enemy's tactics and technology, trying to devise a way to counter their overwhelming firepower and numbers with inferior Nausicaan weapons. It seemed impossible. But the alternative was death for potentially both civilizations. As the shaky Nausicaan-human alliance began to take shape, tensions simmered between the two camps. Most Nausicaans resented having to rely on the aid of a species they viewed as primitive, while some of George's team questioned the morality of helping such a ruthless empire. But with extinction on the line, they had to find a way to work together. Complicating matters further was the maneuvering of a crafty Nausicaan warlord named Zatar, who sought to undermine the human alliance and exploit the crisis for his own political gain, viewing the Terrans as expendable pawns. Zatar's forces actively worked against George's team, sabotaging their efforts. As the pressure mounted and time began to run out before the Nausicaan core worlds fell, George started uncovering clues that this invasion might be more than it seemed, connected to some ancient cosmic mystery that, once solved, could hold the key to turning the tides and cementing humanity's previously minor role in the cosmos, if only he could unravel the truth in time. As George and his team settled into their roles within the Nausicaan military structure, they threw themselves into analyzing every scrap of data they could get their hands on regarding the invaders' tactics and technology. They pored over battle logs, sensor readings, and even salvaged alien wreckage, searching for any exploitable weaknesses or patterns. It was during one of these late-night analysis sessions that George had a sudden epiphany. He noticed that the aliens always pressed their attacks hardest when they faced resistance, but seemed to lose interest and move on when Nausicaan forces retreated too quickly. A plan began to form in his mind, a dangerous gambit, but one that could turn the tide if executed correctly. George brought his proposal to Emperor Sirius. They would choose a Nausicaan colony and turn it into a trap, fortifying it with hidden defenses while appearing to leave it vulnerable. The goal was to lure the aliens into committing a large portion of their fleet to the attack, then spring the trap and inflict maximum damage. Sirius was initially horrified at the idea of using his own people as bait, but George argued passionately for the plan. "Your Majesty, we're out of options. If we don't start taking risks, there won't be an empire left to save." After a tense debate, Sirius reluctantly agreed. The evacuation of the chosen colony began immediately, with George's team working around the clock to fortify the planet and prepare the ambush. They installed hidden missile batteries, minefields, and even a few experimental weapons reverse-engineered from captured alien tech. When the invaders took the bait and descended on the colony in force, George gave the order to spring the trap. The alien ships were caught completely off guard as the colony's hidden defenses opened fire, ripping through their formations with devastating efficiency. For a moment, it seemed like the plan had worked perfectly. But the aliens adapted with terrifying speed, shifting tactics and launching a furious counterattack. The colony's defenses, as potent as they were, began to crumble under the onslaught. Nausicaan and human forces alike were forced to retreat, fighting desperately to escape the planet before they were overrun. In the midst of the chaos, Jack Wilson, George's trusted second-in-command, saw a group of Nausicaan civilians pinned down by enemy fire. Without hesitation, he rushed to their aid, using his own body to shield them as he led them to safety. But just as they reached the evacuation shuttles, Jack was hit by a stray blast. He collapsed, his chest a smoking ruin. George watched in anguish as medics loaded Jack's unconscious form onto a shuttle. He wanted to go with his friend, but he knew his place was on the bridge, coordinating the retreat. As the human and Nausicaan ships fled the colony, leaving it to fall to the invaders, George could only hope that Jack's sacrifice had not been in vain. In the aftermath of the failed ambush, as the Allies regrouped and tended to their wounds, George couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The aliens had adapted too quickly, almost as if they had known what was coming. His suspicions were confirmed when human intelligence operatives intercepted communications between the invaders and a source within the Nausicaan hierarchy. After some digging, they identified the traitor, Zatar, one of Sirius's most trusted generals. The evidence was damning. Surveillance logs showed Zatar sending encrypted transmissions to the alien fleet, providing them with detailed information on Nausicaan strategies and weaknesses. It appeared he was trying to undermine the war effort, hoping to seize power in the resulting chaos. George brought the evidence to Sirius, who was stunned by the depth of Zatar's betrayal. The Emperor immediately ordered Zatar's arrest, but when Nausicaan forces moved to apprehend him, they discovered he had fled, taking a sizable faction of loyal ships with him. It soon became clear that Zatar had openly defected to the alien side. The situation grew even more dire as the invaders, now armed with Zatar's inside knowledge, began picking apart the Alliance's defenses with ruthless efficiency. World after world fell, the Nausicaan lines collapsing faster than they could be shored up. Morale plummeted as the true scale of Zatar's treachery became clear. Desperate for any shred of hope, George threw himself into decrypting Zatar's communications with the aliens, looking for any hint of their plans. As he worked feverishly, he stumbled upon something unexpected. The aliens' language, once thought to be completely foreign, bore striking similarities to an ancient Nausicaan dialect, one that had been dead for millennia. The implications were staggering. Could the invaders have some shared history with the Nausicans? And if so, what did it mean for the war? George knew he needed more information, and he needed it fast. With the situation growing more desperate by the day, George devised a plan as audacious as it was risky. He proposed leading a small, elite team on a mission to infiltrate the alien command ship itself, in the hopes of gathering vital intelligence that could turn the tide of the war. Sirius was initially resistant to the idea, unwilling to risk such a valuable asset as George on what amounted to a suicide mission. But as the Nausicaan body count continued to mount and whispers of unrest began to spread through what remained of the Empire, the Emperor realized he had little choice. And so, George began to assemble his team, handpicking the best and brightest from both the human and Nausicaan ranks. To his surprise, Sirius himself insisted on joining the mission, refusing to send others into danger while he remained safe behind the lines. As the small band of infiltrators prepared to embark on what might well be a one-way trip, George found himself grappling with the enormity of what was at stake. The fate of humanity, of the Nausicaan Empire, perhaps even of the galaxy itself, rested on their shoulders. But even as the weight of that responsibility threatened to crush him, George felt a flicker of something else deep within his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it for what it was: hope. In a seemingly impossible way, against an enemy that seemed invincible, he still believed they had a chance. And so, with a final nod to his team, George stepped aboard the waiting stealth ship, ready to face whatever lay ahead. They were outgunned, outmatched, and quite possibly doomed. But they were not yet beaten. As long as they still drew breath, they would keep fighting, for their worlds, for their species, for the future. The stealth craft sliced through the inky void of space, its advanced cloaking technology rendering it invisible to the alien armada's sensors. Inside, George Cox and his team sat in tense silence, their breath fogging the visors of their envirosuits. "Approaching the command ship," the pilot whispered, his hands steady on the controls. "Prepare for boarding." George nodded, double-checking his weapon. Emperor Sirius, seated beside him, did the same. The massive alien vessel loomed before them, its hull overflowing with weaponry. "Now or never," George muttered. On his signal, the team activated their personal cloaking devices and breached the alien ship's airlock. They crept through dimly lit corridors, passing alien crew members who remained oblivious to their presence. The team's luck didn't hold. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a patrol. "Contact!" someone shouted. The corridor erupted in weapons fire. George ducked behind a bulkhead, returning fire. Alien bodies hit the deck, but two of his team went down as well. "Push forward!" Sirius roared, charging ahead with reckless abandon. They fought their way deeper into the ship, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Alarms blared, and more alien troops poured in to stop them. In the chaos, George lost sight of Sirius. He found himself alone with the Nausicaan Emperor in a narrow passageway. "Look!" Sirius hissed, pointing to a heavily fortified door. "That must be the control center." They shared a look, nodded, and attacked. George tossed a plasma grenade, blowing the door off its hinges. They stormed in, weapons blazing, catching the alien command crew off guard. When the smoke cleared, George and Sirius stood amid alien corpses, the bridge theirs. "Quick, access their database," George ordered, moving to a console. Sirius joined him, but their triumph was short-lived. The alien interface defied their attempts to breach it. "It's no use," Sirius growled in frustration. "We can't—" "Having trouble, gentlemen?" They whirled to face the newcomer. George's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. "Zatar!" Sirius spat. The Nausicaan warlord stepped into view, a smug grin on his face. "Surprised to see me?" "You treasonous snake," Sirius snarled. "You've been working with them all along." Zatar laughed. "Of course. Did you really think your pitiful empire could withstand their might? I merely chose the winning side." "But why?" George demanded. Zatar's form began to shift, his features twisting into something grotesque. Part Nausicaan, part alien. "Because this is my true heritage. My ancestors forged an alliance with these beings eons ago. We seek to reclaim that legacy." George's mind raced, connecting the dots. "The ancient dialect." "Yes," Zatar sneered, "a remnant of that forgotten time. And now, with your deaths, we'll usher in a new era." He raised a weapon, but before he could fire, the rest of George's team burst onto the bridge. The room exploded into chaos once more. George dove for cover, his mind working furiously. He spotted an access port, an idea forming. While Sirius and the others engaged Zatar and his allies, George connected his datapad to the ship's systems. With a triumphant yell, he uploaded a virus. The ship's systems went haywire, giving his team the edge they needed. The battle raged on. George watched in horror as Jack Wilson, his old friend, fell to Zatar's fire. Grief and rage fueled him as he fought on. In the end, it came down to Sirius and Zatar. The two Nausicaans clashed in a brutal duel, blade against blade. With a final, desperate thrust, Sirius ran Zatar through. As the hybrid fell, George realized the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. They had the intel they needed, but at a terrible cost. "We need to go," he told the survivors. "This ship's about to become a very unfriendly place." They fled, carrying their dead and wounded. As their craft sped away from the crippled command ship, George knew the war had changed. They had a chance now, but the revelation of the Nausicaans' connection to these invaders would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. The fight was not nearly finished. In fact, it had only just begun. The stealth ship barely made it back to the Alliance's hidden base. As George and Sirius stumbled out, battered and bloodied, a crowd gathered to hear news of their mission. George held up a data cube. "We got it. Now let's figure out how to use it." Hours later, in a secure war room, Alliance leaders huddled around holographic displays. George plugged in the cube, and alien text scrolled across the screens. "What are we looking at?" asked Admiral Chen of the human fleet. George took a deep breath. "The truth about our enemy. They call themselves the Zillion, and they have a connection to the Nausicaans that goes back millennia." Angry murmurs erupted from the Nausicaan contingent. General Kraz smacked his fist on the table. "Lies! Our people would never ally with these monsters." "It's true," Sirius said quietly. "I saw the evidence myself. Our ancestors and the Zillion were once partners in genetic engineering." The room erupted into chaos. Accusations flew as tempers flared. George let it play out for a few minutes before shouting for order. "Listen, I know this is hard to accept, but understanding our shared past might be the key to beating them now." He gestured to the screens. "Look here, the Zillion's frontline troops. They're not pure alien. They're hybrids, spliced with Nausicaan DNA." "Abominations," someone muttered. "Maybe," George conceded, "but also a weakness we can exploit. These drones rely on a hive mind controlled by the Zillion ships. If we can disrupt that signal..." He laid out his plan to hijack the drone's command protocols. It was audacious, maybe impossible, but as the commanders debated, a spark of hope ignited. Days later, George crouched in the shadows of a massive Zillion shipyard. Sirius and a hand-picked team flanked him, all in scavenged Zillion armor. They'd come too far to fail now. "On my mark," George whispered. He tapped his wrist computer and a nearby security door slid open. They sprinted inside. Alarms blared almost immediately. Zillion guards converged, weapons blazing. George's team fought back desperately, inching towards the central control hub. "There!" Sirius shouted over the din. A glowing pillar rose before them, pulsing with alien energy. George slammed the virus module into place. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the pillar's light shifted from blue to red. "It's working!" George yelled. "Fall back!" They retreated, pursued by confused Zillion troops. But as they neared their extraction point, the pursuers suddenly froze. Then, to George's amazement, they turned and opened fire on their own kind. "Holy shit!" Sirius breathed. "It actually worked!" George allowed himself a grim smile as they boarded their escape craft. Now for Phase 2. The Alliance fleet decloaked, weapons hot. As George's ship rejoined the Armada, he watched thousands of hijacked drones tear into the Zillion defenses. The shipyard, once impregnable, began to crumble. For days, the battle raged across the sector. Freed from Zillion control, the drones fought with terrifying efficiency. The tide was turning. Then a priority alert flashed across George's command console. "New contact, something big." A colossal shape emerged from hyperspace. Easily the size of a small moon, its surface writhed with twisted biomechanical tendrils. "Leviathan," someone whispered in awe and terror. Before anyone could react, searing beams lanced out from the monstrosity. Entire ships vanished in nuclear fire. In minutes, half the human fleet was reduced to vapor and drifting debris. George watched in horror as the last human dreadnought, The UES Defiant was ripped apart. Thousands of lives snuffed out in an instant. "No," he growled, fists clenched. "No more. We're taking that thing down if it's the last thing I do." He turned to Sirius, fire in his eyes. "I need volunteers for a suicide mission." Sirius nodded grimly. "You'll have them." The behemoth Leviathan drifted lifelessly in space, its once formidable bulk now a floating graveyard. George Cox stood on the bridge of the Alliance flagship, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The victory had been costly, but it had given them a chance. "All ships form up," he ordered. "We strike now, while they're reeling." The combined fleets of humans and Nausicaans surged forward, punching through the weakened Zillion defenses. As they approached the heavily fortified planet that served as the enemy's primary staging area, George turned to Emperor Sirius. "Ready for some ground action?" he asked. Sirius nodded, his reptilian features set in a grim mask. "Let's end this." Their dropship screamed through the planet's atmosphere, dodging streams of energy fire from surface-to-air batteries. George gripped the overhead rail as they touched down hard on the outskirts of a vast industrial complex. "Move! Move!" he shouted, leading his strike team out into the acrid air. They sprinted across open ground, weapons at the ready. Ahead, the Zillion shipyards loomed, a sprawling maze of twisted metal and pulsing bioorganic structures. A shriek split the air. Something huge and monstrous burst from a nearby building, all tentacles and cybernetic implants. It lashed out, snatching up two of George's team before they could react. "Scatter!" George yelled, diving for cover. The air filled with weapons fire as more Zillion monstrosities poured from the complex. George's team fought desperately, their shots barely slowing the tide of nightmarish creations. They pushed deeper into the shipyards, leaving a trail of Zillion corpses in their wake. George's breath came in ragged gasps as they fought their way through cramped corridors and vast assembly bays. Suddenly, they stumbled into a cavernous chamber. At its center stood a towering figure, part machine, part writhing flesh, the Prime Archon. "By the gods," Sirius whispered. They watched in horror as the ancient entity merged with a massive cybernetic construct, its consciousness flowing into the abomination like quicksilver. "We have to stop it," George shouted. "Overload the fusion chamber." His team rushed forward, planting explosives around the base of the construct. But before they could detonate, the thing's eyes flared to life. With terrifying speed, it lashed out, scattering George's forces like insects. The chamber erupted into chaos. George found himself separated from Sirius, desperately trying to avoid the construct's devastating attacks. All around him, Alliance soldiers fell to the unstoppable juggernaut. "George!" Sirius's voice cut through the din. "I'll draw its fire. Get to the command nexus." Before George could protest, Sirius charged the construct, roaring a battle cry. The Nausicaan Emperor fought with savage fury, buying precious seconds. George sprinted for the far end of the chamber, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard a deafening explosion. He turned to see Sirius engulfed in flames, the construct staggering back, its armor scorched and smoking. Choking back grief, George pressed on. He found the entrance to the command nexus and forced his way inside. Banks of alien computers surrounded him, pulsing with otherworldly energy. George's fingers flew across his datapad, uploading a virus into the Zillion systems. Alarms blared as the Prime Archon's programming began to unravel. Outside, he heard the sounds of renewed destruction. The construct, freed from its master's control, was tearing through the shipyards in a mindless rampage. George ran, the complex collapsing around him. He emerged into chaos, Alliance and Zillion forces alike fleeing the construct's onslaught. As the dust settled, George stood amid the ruins of the Zillion's once mighty staging area. The construct lay in pieces, its rampage finally ended. But the cost had been enormous. George surveyed the devastation, his heart heavy. They had won, but at what price? The galaxy would never be the same.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.